Many of you have been here before, and you know that we do a little security announcement first. And so if you hear a voice that says, we have to leave, please follow my directions, we'll take these doors that are right behind me here. This one's the one that's closest to the stairs that take us down to the street. Take two left-hand turns and a right, we'll go over to National Geographic. I think they're going to be still open, and you know, they got a great show on right now. So we'll take care, we'll get everybody a little entertainment. But nothing's going to happen, don't worry. You know, I do lots of introductions for people. This is the only person I don't need to introduce. And the reason is because all of you are here because you know of his intellect. This is a man who has for 30 years been writing the most thoughtful pieces to help the rest of us think. You know, and it's been such an important contribution for all of our maturity that we had someone who was, you know, laying the foundation stones of thinking. And we need that. You know, every society needs somebody like that. And we've been very fortunate that Joe Nye has been doing that for our country. His most recent book, I want to just put it in context. It's not about the turmoils of right now. I'm sure he may reflect on that a little bit, but this is a book that's been in formulation in his mind for many years. And it's a leitmotif that runs through American society. You know, at one point we're a country of enormous idealism, and then sometimes we're very ruthlessly cynical. You know, and how do we account for all of that? You know, what does it mean, and what's our true direction? What's true north for us? It's a big question, and when we're at a kind of a time when circumstances, events, personalities are causing us to reflect personally on this very fundamental question. We need a guide because it is a confusing time, and our guide tonight is Dr. Joe Nye. Would you please welcome him with your warm applause?
Thank you very much, John, and it's nice to be back at CSIS, which has contributed so much to American thinking about foreign policy, and I've always been very proud to my association with this organization and with John Hamre, who's a great leader of it. Let me take about 10 minutes just to tell you what the book's about, and then Andrew and I are going to go back and forth, and then we're going to have a back and forth with you all. But basically, I was explaining to a friend at dinner when she asked me, what are you up to now? I said, I'm writing a book on presidents and ethics and foreign policy. And she said, good, it'll be a short book. And there is a conventional wisdom that it's all about national interests. When you think about international relations where there's no larger government, no way to enforce the law and so forth, everything is just a matter of national interest. Or as you might put it, interests bake the cake, and then politicians come along and sprinkle a little moral arguments about on top of it, like icing to make the cake look pretty, but it's all about national interest. And we see this a bit when you have something like a phrase like America First that President Trump has used. People sometimes say, yeah, why shouldn't he say America first? After all, a democratic leader is elected to serve the national interest. So if you're Macron, it should be France first. If you're Japan, it should be Abe first, or Abe, Japan first, rather, and so on. But that is not a very interesting answer, because to say that leaders in democracies are elected to fulfill the national interest or protect it is almost a tautology or a truism. It doesn't tell you anything. The question is, how do they define the national interest? How broadly or narrowly do they define it? And that's where the ethics comes in. We've seen a good deal of discussion in recent years about cosmopolitanism. They're these rootless cosmopolitans who don't have a feeling for nationalism versus true patriotic Americans, and it's either or. But, you know, that's not the way the world is. It's not the way we are. Most people have multiple senses of community. You can have a sense of common humanity at the same time you have a strong sense of nationalism. They're not either or. And when you try to say that it is only either or, you're making a big mistake. Let me give you a simple little example to illustrate what I mean. Imagine you're sitting by the beach reading a good book and you're really engrossed. Suppose it's my book. And you say, gee, I want to finish this chapter. And you hear somebody call out in the surf saying, help, help. Would you put down the book and go help them? Of course you would. Suppose, though, that you're still engrossed in the book, but you hear ayúdame, ayúdame, and say, foreign language, I'll keep reading, I got to finish this chapter. Of course not. You would jump in and help. The nationality wouldn't matter in the least. So in that sense, this view that it's cosmopolitans versus Americans or versus nationalists is just nonsense. We all have multiple senses of community, maybe like concentric circles, which lead us to do certain things. And at the other side of that question is the importance of nationality and a national interest. So if, to continue my same analogy, you're on the beach reading the book, and you look up and there are two children drowning 20, 30 feet out in the surf, but you only have time to save one, and one of them is your child, would you be morally justified in saving your own child? And the answer, I think most people would say, is yes, because your role as parent introduces another ethical obligation, which is, as a parent, you're responsible for this person, and they have an expectation from you that this is how you will react. So you wouldn't flip a coin, you would save your own child first. So that's an illustration about this multiple levels or concentric circles of moral obligation we have. And to say that it's either or, America first and it stops at the water's edge, is just not the way we are. In fact, it's not just about Americans, it's about the human species. I mean, evolutionary biologists have shown that the fact that, that humans have a capacity for altruism is why we've evolved as a species the way we have. Be able to make major organizations which can do things that packs of wolves or groups of giraffes or bears can't do. Now, we also have great capacity for evil, but we should not deny the fact that humanity is complex. We Americans are complex, and to say it's America first and that means it all stops at the water's edge or at the border is just not a very good assessment of the world. So one of the things I'm trying to get across in this book is to get people to understand that these simplistic types of propositions, national interest, America first, doesn't solve any of the real moral issues of foreign policy. So what should we do? How do we think about it? And here I've suggested in the book something I call three-dimensional morality, or 3D morality. And I say that basically, when we judge moral issues, we are not going to just judge them on one dimension or another. We usually think of all three. And we look at the motives somebody has, the means they use, and the consequences. And if you say, okay, well, that sounds really fancy, it's not just about foreign policy. Let me give you another simple example. Imagine that your daughter is going to take the SATs tomorrow, and she's going to the high school dance, and a friend tells you he'll drive her back and make sure she gets home early. And good intentions. But suppose in driving her back to get her home early, he uses inappropriate means. It's a slippery, icy night, the road is slick, and he drives too fast. And then he skids off the road, and your daughter is killed. horrible, immoral consequence. Would you say, oh, that's okay, he had good intentions? Of course not. And the same thing goes in foreign policy. Suppose that we grant, for example, that President George W. Bush had good intentions of democratizing the Middle East. But suppose he wasn't attentive to the means that would allow him to really democratize the Middle East, and suppose he did a very inadequate assessment of the probable consequences and didn't pay attention to some of the preliminary work that had been done about the difficulties of reconstruction in Iraq, and the consequences turned out badly. Isn't that a lot like this road accident I mentioned? And Vietnam, you could make is the same kind of case. So what we have to learn to do as Americans is not to focus on one of these three dimensions, but to focus on all three. Americans have a tremendous tendency to moralism. We say moral things. It's not the same as morality or moral reasoning. Moralism means I state brilliant intentions. Morality means I think about how they will interact with means to produce consequences that are good. And that is the difference between moralism and morality. So what we need to learn to do in this country is to have a public dialogue about morality and foreign policy, which goes beyond fine words, sometimes called moral clarity, or that goes beyond just the results. Well, it came out all right, therefore it's good. And ask, was it good in terms of the motives, the means, and the consequences? And what I tried to do in the book is look at all 14 presidents since 1945, what you might call the American era, and ask, did their moral views make a difference? And I think historically I can show that they did. And how do we judge them? So I do a scorecard, a little score sheet for each of these presidents. I'll tip you off so you don't have to look at the book to get to the answers. I put them in three tiers. The top quartile in my ratings of the presidents are what I call the founders, Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower, plus the first President Bush. The bottom quartile are basically Johnson, Nixon, the second President Bush, and temporarily at least, because his grade should be incomplete, the current president, but we don't know the final result yet. Now, I stretch everybody else out in between those two top and bottom quartiles. But the point I want to end on is when you look at the book, don't worry about whether you agree or disagree with my particular conclusion or my scoring. I change my own scoring. I changed it during the time of writing the book. I've changed it over the years as I've learned more. And we know that with time, we often see new information or have new judgments. So don't worry about whether you think I got Nixon in the right place or not. Worry about the way I reasoned to think through how I compared these presidents and the morality of their foreign policy. Because my hope for this book is that if we're going to have a good debate about morality and foreign policy in our democracy, we'll have to improve our moral reasoning. We're going to have to look at all three things at the same time, motives, means, and consequences, figure out how to balance them, argue and agree and disagree with each other about how that comes out in particular cases, but not settle for the shallow type of reasoning that's either Americans only, or that it's Americans are more pure than others, moralism, or that if it turned out all right, that means it was good. Those are the types of moral reasoning which are unacceptable. Trying to think through three-dimensional ethics, motives, means, and consequences, is essential if we're going to deal with the major challenges we face in the future, which in the end of the book I suggest include things like China and climate change and cyber threats and so forth. So if you have a chance to look at the book, that's what you want to think about. How do we do better moral reasoning in our democracy, not whether Nye was right on where he put Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy. So thank you, and Andrew, over to you.
Joe, we're so glad you're here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us here tonight. I'm Andrew Schwartz. I'm our Chief Communications Officer, and I have the honor of having our trustee, Joe Nye, who's been a great mentor to me ever since I've been here at CSIS. We work together closely on a variety of projects, and this is at least the third book launch since I've been here that we've done with Joe. And Joe writes, I think you write a book every year or 2 years, something like that, right?
My father used to say, please stop.
Well, don't stop, don't stop. Please don't stop is what we say. Joe, one of the things that I think a lot of people are going to be tempted to do when they get their hands on this book, I know I was tempted, is the first thing, you trace the president since 1945, as you just mentioned. Well, as soon as I got my hands on the book, I tore it open and I said, I got to look at the score for President Trump.
Right.
So, I wanted to know what was going on with Trump. But before we start talking about President Trump, I want to ask you, so many scholars have written about rationality and probability and uncertainty and all these kinds of things, but not a lot of scholars have written about morals and ethics in American foreign policy. Why do you think that is?
Well, I somewhat facetiously say in the preface of the book that it's not a career-enhancing move. So if you're a young scholar, to get into this area is not your best track to tenure. But since I'm old and tenured, I can do whatever I please.
Right. So how long had you been thinking about doing this?
Oh, I've been thinking about it for a long time. When I was in the Carter administration, to show you how old I am, responsible for nuclear proliferation, Jimmy Carter appointed an assistant secretary for human rights in the State Department named Pat Darien, a wonderful woman. But Pat wanted everything to be human rights. I wanted everything to be stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. We went to Argentina together with the Secretary of State, and I remember we argued in the cabin of the plane about this. I said, Pat, there are no human rights among the incinerated. And she said, you're just a cynical realist. And we never quite resolved that. But it made me start thinking about how do you balance all these things? And subsequently, I think I have evolved to thinking we probably should place more emphasis on human rights than I did when I was responsible just for nuclear proliferation. But it's not an either or. You wind up with trade-offs on these things.
So where does your analysis of morals and ethics fit into the debate about rational decision-making?
Well, the big question is when you're trying to make a judgment as a president or any kind of a political leader, you never have enough information, and you don't have enough time, or you rarely have enough time. And so what's the best you can do? And what I argue in the book is that when you're trying to think about consequences of your actions, you have a responsibility to think of the probabilities of unintended consequences and weigh the degree of immorality if you get those assessments wrong. And if there is too high a risk or you're too uncertain and you think you do not have enough capacity to do this, then be careful. And that goes to my point about the car accident in Bush and Iraq. I mean, he had not weighed through the unintended consequences properly, but it also can affect. A president can do things to try to get himself more time and information. For example, John F. Kennedy, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, once the missiles had been discovered, if they had had a decision, if the NSC had met or you just go into the Situation Room and made a decision within 24 hours, because this was urgent, we would have had a war. And there's a chance that it would have been nuclear war. The strategy would have been to drop bombs. Kennedy, to his great credit, created a new entity, which was a larger decision-making group which would, you call it the executive committee, and which was meaningless. It was just a way for him to buy time and buy information. So you stretch this out over 2 weeks. And fortunately, that gave them the time to think through and communicate with the Soviets to get arrangement which prevented war, including nuclear war. So presidents, even when they're trying to make a rational decision and they know they don't have enough time and they don't have enough information, you can still see, can I set up a process to improve? I'll never have perfect information or enough time, but can I try to buy some more time, get some more information to improve the quality of my assessment of these likely unintended consequences?
Do you think people in the last several administrations have the training and the expertise to go through this kind of thought process? I've had the opportunity to watch you, Dr. Kissinger, our late colleague, Dr. Brzezinski, Dr. Hamre, and others think like this, talk like this in our meetings, really go through this process. But in our day and age now, where the news cycle is so fast, where things are moving at light speed, do last couple administrations, do they have that?
Well, people said about the Obama administration that something like Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis would be impossible because of the role of the press and leaks in Washington and so forth. But notice that in the killing of Osama bin Laden, it did stay quiet.
Yeah.
They were able to do it. So it's not impossible. But the other thing that your comment points out is that good moral outcomes and good moral processes require attention to the way we do decision making. It's not just sitting in getting it right in your own mind. It means organizing in such a way that you can get moral outcomes. And one of the things that bothers me about the current administration, if I believe the press and comments that have been told to me by friends in the administration, is the process has atrophied, that the Deputies Committee, which was so important to make sure that all agencies were represented before a decision, that different points of view were taken into account, that this is shrunk to a king and his courtier of the moment. And we're now on our 4th national security advisor. It may be that the king and his courtier make the right decision or not, but it doesn't represent a wide range of information. And the nice thing about having a good process in a democracy is different parts of our democratic views are represented in different agencies. Commerce is going to look at a problem from one direction, state's going to look in another direction, defense in another direction, special trade reps in another direction. You want to get all those views out and have a chance to tug and pull and to get them out, and you want to also get them across to the Congress with consultations with the Congress. That sets a framework where you're more likely to get a moral foreign policy. Now, you can argue there are cases where it won't work. Obama didn't use the full NSC in the preparations for the bin Laden assault, so it doesn't fit for everything. But on a lot of things, when you truncate the process to just the king and a courtier, you are basically setting the framework for less moral decision making.
So let's take the example of President Trump's recent decision to withdraw from Syria, which left our allies, the Kurds, in a bind, which left a power vacuum, and had some second, third, and fourth order consequences, some of which we haven't even seen yet, which we don't know yet. Do you think the administration was prepared to walk through the exercise, to think through the second, third, fourth order consequences, had mapped all that out and made a decision along the lines that your training and your thought process and what you've laid out here would have gone through?
Well, if I believe what I read from the press, and I think it comes from many different accounts, so I suspect it's largely correct, there was not much second order thinking. I mean, there wasn't a lot of sampling of different views or thinking if this, then that, and what are the consequences. And that's true not just of the withdrawal of support for our allies in Syria. It could also be, that same kind of criticism could be applied to the recent killing of General Soleimani in Iran, I mean, the Iranian general in Baghdad. And the cover of the London Economist last week was interesting, and the first article said, how are we going to assess whether Trump pulled off a brilliant coup with killing Soleimani or whether it was a terrible mistake?
I think it was the cover, Madness or Masterstroke.
That's right,
yeah.
Madness or Masterstroke. And I like The Economist, I usually agree with them, but I think they missed something. They assess this in what philosophers call act utilitarianism. Given this one narrow act, is it going to come out that it succeeded or didn't succeed? So if Iran is deterred, then it worked, therefore it's good. No, that's not the way I reason through these things. There were some other things that were involved. For example, the president crossed two very important red lines of morals and institutions. He restored the role of assassination that President Ford had stopped. Do we really want to get back in a world in which assassinating senior officials of other governments is widespread and legitimate? What happens when Secretary Pompeo or CIA Director Haskell goes to Baghdad and is assassinated? Will we not protest? I mean, is this really the world we want to be in? And the other one was the whole concept of self-defense. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, self-defense is against an imminent threat, not revenge for something a bad guy did some years ago or might do in the future. And by stretching self-defense so that it wasn't widely believed, he damaged another of these international norms. So an act utilitarian, somebody who looks just at the consequences of a single act, killing this man, Soleimani, who was not a very nice man, it appears, that is not a full moral assessment. You have to say, what were the effects on the framework of rules which will determine future actions? And that is sometimes called rule utilitarianism or rule consequentialism. The words don't matter as much as taking a broader range of considerations before you go and act. Now you could say, yes, but it restored deterrence, but were there alternative ways to restore deterrence, such as striking an Iranian missile site or sinking an Iranian command and control ship in the middle of the Persian Gulf, which might not have broken those two basic rules or norms of international morality. So I think The Economist's cover and the lead editorial missed what I call my three-dimensional moral thinking. They did one-dimensional based on consequences only.
So this brings me to my next question. Some might argue that it only matters if a foreign policy decision worked, not if it was moral or rational. Why do you believe otherwise?
Well, if you say if it's just whether it works, that means you don't concern yourself about what other alternatives could have cost less. I've had a debate, which is replayed in the book a little bit with friends, about Vietnam. When Richard Nixon became president, he knew that they couldn't win in Vietnam. There wasn't a question of we'll give it one more try to get it over the goal line. He knew we were going to lose. The question is, how did you get out? And he figured you had to have what he called a decent interval between when we got out and when the North Vietnamese took over Saigon. And that decent interval turned out to be 2 years. We spent 22,000 American lives to buy 2 years. 2 years. Was that a worthy goal? Were there alternatives? Could we have found other ways to have gotten out more rapidly without having that many American and countless Vietnamese lives lost? I have friends who, very moral people, very thoughtful historians, who disagree with me on this. So it's not as though I have the right answer, but you have to ask the question that way. Not, did he eventually get out of Vietnam? Yes. But could he have got out with lower costs, with lower moral costs?
Can a decision be moral but not rational, or vice versa?
Oh yes, I mean a lot of decisions. Some things are moral but not rational, and I'll give you the example of Harry Truman and going to Korea. A rational analysis of America's interests at the beginning of 1950 was made by Dean Acheson at the State Department, Secretary of State. And he made a speech, and he said, and he looked at the threat from Stalin to Europe and our primary interests in Europe. He looked at the Chinese communist positions in Asia. He looked at the importance of protecting Japan. And he said, but Korea, which is divided, it's really not a major national interest. That was a very rational analysis. Maybe not a very nice analysis, but typical realist, rational analysis. So he gave a speech saying Korea is outside our defense perimeter. 6 months later, Kim Il-sung crosses the 38th parallel and tries to take over South Korea. Harry Truman hears about this, and he doesn't go back and say to Acheson, how did you do that analysis in January? He says, this reminds me of Hitler entering the Rhineland in the 1930s. It's aggression, we're not going to let it stand. It was an emotional reaction or an intuitive reaction, not a rational reaction. Now, some people will say it was a bad decision. Not everybody agrees we should have intervened in the Korean War. Others will say it was the right decision. It upheld the principle of collective security under the UN Security Council. It had a Security Council resolution backing it. But whichever you regard this as a good or bad decision, Acheson's description was rational. Truman's was intuitive.
In a recent op-ed that reflected on your book, you wrote that too much of the current debate focuses on President Trump's personality, and that your new book, Do Morals Matter, attempts to correct this by showing that some of President Trump's actions are not unprecedented for US presidents since World War II. And that you went on to say, as a perceptive reporter once remarked to you, quote, Trump is not unique, he's just extreme. What did you mean by that?
Well, I feel a lot of our discussion about morality and foreign policy has gotten wrapped around the axle of Donald Trump, like so much else in our political process. But a lot of the important questions long antedate Donald Trump. And that's why I wanted to go back in history and look for real examples about how well did we do moral reasoning through all 14 presidents. I was afraid that if you just looked at Trump, you would not get that broader picture you need. And it also would polarize things. You'd be either pro-Trump or anti-Trump. I wanted people not to worry about whether they like Trump or not, but to think through how well are we reasoning morally about foreign policy issues. And so that statement that Trump was not unique but extreme represented the fact that I can find examples for much of Trump's behavior that we find morally objectionable in prior presidents. But I can't find anybody who did it quite to the extreme that he does.
Who reminds you most of some of his behaviors?
Well, I'll give you an example that might surprise you, which is Franklin Roosevelt was a tremendous liar.
It does surprise me.
Well, but it's interesting that Roosevelt often told lies, and he was criticized for it. And Roosevelt comes out in my pantheon at the top. But then that leads you to say, okay, but let's make some distinctions now between types of lies and amount of lies. Roosevelt sometimes told what I call self-regarding lies, things that made life more convenient or easier politically for himself. But The lies that he told that were very important were, you might call them, other regarding lies. For example, in 1941, when he was trying to get the American people to give up isolationism and to face up to Hitler and the threat he posed, he told his press secretary, what do you do if you're the leader in a democracy and you look over your shoulder and nobody's following? And his answer, he lied. He told the American people that the a German U-boat had attacked an American destroyer, the Greer. In fact, the facts were the opposite. The Greer had first attacked the German U-boat. But he felt that lie was not to make his life easier, it was to alert the American people to the threat of Germany. So he regarded it as a lie for a paternalistic lie.
Okay, so that's kind of a moral lie, though. That's not a bad lie.
Well, yeah, but he told a few others that were when he told. But the main point is you got to distinguish between self-regarding and other-regarding. But the other thing is Roosevelt never lied openly that much. And if the Washington Post is correct, that in his first 1,000 days in office, President Trump told something like 15,000 untruths.
Yeah.
Even if it's half of that or a quarter of that, the previous presidents never went to that extreme. So lying was not unique. The extremes of it are unique, and the danger of that is it debases the currency. If you lie all the time, particularly for convenience, nobody's going to believe you when you need it at a time of crisis.
Do you think anybody believes him now?
Well, if you look at the reactions to the statements the administration made at the UN Security Council that our attack on Soleimani was because of an imminent threat to American embassies, I don't think anybody believed that, including some Republicans in the Senate.
Well, including, the administration had a hard time getting its story straight amongst itself.
Right. That makes it even worse.
Right. Let me ask you this. So President Trump's challenging the international liberal order, and that's defined U.S. morals since 1945. But does this mean that our nation's morals are changing, or is the president violating our nation's morals?
Well, the whole question of American morality is a difficult one. We've always considered ourselves a moral people. In the 19th century, we said the European balance of power is immoral, and we Americans are more pure. We hark back to the Puritans and to the Enlightenment founding fathers. But you know what? If you were a Mexican or a Philippine, and you looked at the fact that we used aggression and torture, we weren't that moral. But we thought we were. We claimed it. This is American exceptionalism. And that's the kind of moralism that people like George Kennan and other realists have objected to, and properly, which we don't have a perfect history. On the other hand, there are cases where you can see the Americans making decisions which had enormous moral implications. After the terrible decade of the 30s, which led to depression, prelude to genocide in World War II, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower came to the conclusion that we had to create an institutional framework for the post-war world. We had enormous power. We had half the world economy. We had the only nuclear weapons. We could have pretty much done what we wanted. But their action was not, how do I get a narrow empire or hegemony? How do I create a liberal international order of rules-based decisions which can lead to a greater prospect for order so we don't repeat the 1930s? That was profoundly important as a set of moral decisions. And what's happening right now is that liberal international order, which had never been challenged in 70 years, began to be challenged in 2016. And President Trump was the first presidential candidate of a major party who challenged this order which was created after World War II. And how that's going to turn out or not, we just don't know yet.
I want to open it up to some of your questions. I know all of you have questions. We have a microphone coming through. You can raise your hand. We have one right here in the front, this young lady right here.
Thanks so much. I'm Chen Liu from China, and thanks you for your wonderful presentations and speeches. Professor Nye, I have two questions for you. One is, in your opening speech, you mentioned China. So I'm just wondering that, what role do you think the morality is playing in current US-China policy, and what role it should be playing? And the second one is that you've just mentioned 3 dimensions to evaluate morality, and do these 3 dimensions means the same importance to you, or maybe means and consequences could mean much more important than the intentions? Thank you.
Well, in the last chapter of the book, I say that we're facing we meaning the American people, are facing some major challenges, which, if we handle them badly, can have enormous immoral consequences. And one of them is how we handle the rise of China. The fact that the British didn't successfully handle the rise of Germany in the beginning of the 20th century led to a war which essentially disrupted the 20th century. We can't, if we allow our disputes with China to produce either a new Cold War or a hot war, it will be enormously immoral in its consequences. So we have to be very careful in the rhetoric we use in both capitals, Washington and Beijing, to not allow an exaggeration. China poses problems to us, and we should respond to those problems. But to underestimate or to overestimate China, I think would be a serious violation of my third point about the importance of consequences. So there is a whole stretch or section of the book that talks about how to handle that. With that said, there may be situations where China is doing things which we regard as immoral, and we should speak up about it. Issues like Xinjiang, which is described the surveillance system and incarceration system in Xinjiang, which is described in that same issue of The Economist that I just mentioned, the recent issue, are things that offend our views of human rights. And we should not fear to speak up about that. It doesn't mean we break off relations. Much of human rights issues, moral issues, are things where we do want to stand up for values, because values are important. They're a source of our soft power. But it doesn't mean that there are no other interests in foreign policy. And foreign policy and human rights policy are not the same thing. Human rights is part of foreign policy, but how much we destroy or trade off other interests, whether military, economic, social, and so forth, is going to have to be argued out in a democracy case by case. So yes, we should speak out on issues where we believe that China is violating human rights. China will have its own views, but we have to keep it in the context of a larger foreign policy in which managing a rise of China and developing a broader rules-based international system is essential.
Questions right over here. We have a microphone coming right there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dr. Nye. Andy Loomis. I'm a State Department officer on detail to the NIC, and I'm curious about if you could say a few words about the role of the public. And
public diplomacy.
The public. No, the public broadly. So how and to what degree does the public evaluate presidents according to these 3 frames of morality? Or is the public generally pretty much concerned with just outcomes, and do they dismiss means? I assume they don't, but I'm just curious if you've looked at that, how sensitive the public is.
Well, there's actually quite a lot written about that, and I try to summarize some of it in the book. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs has a poll every couple of years on do you want a outward-oriented or an inward-oriented American foreign policy. What's interesting is about a third of the American people have been consistently isolationist. I mean, you know, so the area of the number of people who say they want an outward foreign policy varies somewhere between about 62% to about 70%. Last year's poll showed it was 70% wanted an outward-oriented foreign policy. That still leaves a lump of about 30% who've been consistently isolationist. It's been there all the time, and it's probably going to continue to be there. Then the question within that, let's call it 66%, the 2/3 of the American public that wants an outward-oriented foreign policy. The question of how much do we want attention to issues like human rights, how much do we want attention to just economic issues, how much do we want to intervene militarily in other countries? You get big differences and variations. And some of my friends, like my colleague Steve Walt, argued that it's the liberal elite in foreign policy, he calls it the blob, which is leading on interventionism. But there have been other polls that have been done, careful polls that show that the public generally cares more about jobs and not getting involved militarily, but they are actually more interested in preserving international institutions like the UN or the World Court than the elite is. So it's a very complex answer, but it's an important question. And I think it's a mistake to oversimplify it as we're all one way or we're all the other.
Okay. Question right here, sir, right here, in the front.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. I'm wondering if your analysis works at some level maybe deeper than nations. So, for example, if the sustainability goals are the sort of greatest moral challenge we face, are we ever going to get to them if we only analyse things through nations? My father sub-edited The Economist for 40 years, and because he was a teenager in World War II navigating airplanes over modern-day Myanmar, he thought part of the problem was to go beyond the 8 empires and then to go beyond, even the 200 national borders if we were ever going to end poverty all over the world.
But is the question, what exactly is the question that you wanted to make?
Well, my question is, if we accept, let's say, sustainability goals between generations as the biggest moral challenge we have today, can we get to achieving those through an analysis which assumes that nations are going to determine what the future is?
Well, again, this is something I try to deal with at the end of the book. I said we have traditional challenges like the rise of China. We have a new set of challenges, which I call transnational, which are problems which don't recognize national borders. They cross borders outside the control of government. And a great example of this is climate change. And then you say, well, this is a real threat, and to deny the science doesn't solve it. It's a real problem. And the US and China together produce 40% of the CO2, which is having these effects on climate. And then you say, in traditional international politics, what could we do about it using traditional state instruments? Well, you could bomb coal plants in China. No, it's not going to work. You could embargo all Chinese trade until China stops burning coal. What about US? And other countries, Australia is also burning coal. So the traditional approach to it just doesn't work. And the answer is you're going to have to learn to develop coalitions, which include countries like China, Europe, Japan, Australia, and others, to deal with these problems. So even though the problems cross borders outside of the control of nation states, you can't solve them without getting cooperation among nation states. And to get there, we're going to have to change the way we think. We often think of power over others. But when you're dealing with one of the problems of the type you mentioned, you can't solve them unless you have power with others. And as long as we keep thinking power over is going to solve it, I'll bomb the Chinese coal plants, no, it's not going to work. If I can get China to agree to a set of goals which will reduce the carbon intensity of their growth, which we saw in Paris in 2015, I can begin a process in the right direction. So yes, it raises a number of important moral issues, a large part of which goes to how we think about the problem.
Time for just a couple more, right over here, sir, in the front.
Thank you so much. Jim Shear, the Wilson Center, and former research assistant to Professor Joe Nye.
And a good one.
Question, on the scorecard that you develop, how did you wrestle with the issue of counterfactual outcomes? I'm thinking President George Herbert Walker Bush did not march into Baghdad in 2000 after the Gulf War, and Shia and Kurds paid a consequence. We did not march into Rwanda in 1994. We did engage in Benghazi prior to Gaddafi's threat, which might have cost tens of thousands of lives. But this is a very challenging problem. I'm just curious to know how you...
Well, you're absolutely right that one has to entertain and analyze counterfactuals to try to judge how an action looked at the time and how it came out. And because counterfactuals by definition never happened, it's what might have happened, you have to set up certain procedures to be really careful and rigorous in how you analyze them. And I've tried to do that elsewhere in some of the things I've written. You have to pay attention to causation, to timing, and a variety of other factors. And you have to admit the prospects that your counterfactuals are wrong and say, if something else had happened, then this might not have come out the way I thought, so forth. So your point is right. The book is full of counterfactuals. But if you didn't do them, I don't think you could do the type of analysis. One of my favorite counterfactuals, which relates to a moral issue, not ones, you mentioned very good ones, Jim, but I always think of Harry Truman. Harry Truman was often vilified as the man who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And people then say, well, you know, this terrible man. But how's this for a counterfactual, which is when General MacArthur said to him, unless you allow me to drop 25 to 40 bombs, nuclear weapons, on Chinese cities, you're going to lose in Korea and it's going to destroy your presidency. And he said, I won't do it. That was enormously important because imagine, counterfactually, that we had started treating nuclear weapons as normal weapons to be used all the time. The world would look very different today.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up because it's time to sell some books. I know each one of you is going to buy 2. We have enough to go around. Joe is going to graciously sign some right out there. We have a great reception for all of you. So with your applause, please join me in thanking Dr. Nye.
Thank you.